Song of Mornius, Chapter 8. Galen held on tight to the back of Tarek's saddle, his body lurching in rhythm with Darkfire's high-stepping strides through the powdery snow. Gripping the cantle with his thighs, he fought to stay centered on the horse's broad hips as the animal's muscles bunched and stretched beneath him. Slabs of ice and weathered shale crunched in the heavy silence, collapsing under the weight of the sleds and the burdened hooves of the animals. It was the third day, Galen realized, and they were crossing below the glacial summit of the endless white peaks. Panting for breath, closing his eyes at the ache in his skull, he pressed forward against his benefactor's spine. Abruptly, Tarek reined in his horse. Then, leather creaking, he turned in his saddle and squinted, his tired eyes surveying the straggled line of his dispirited men. "We rest here," he called. With a grateful sigh, Galen slid out from under the blanket he shared with Tarek and down from Darkfire's rump. Pain stabbed through his knees as his feet hit the ice, and the muscles of his inner thighs spasmed. Shivering, he limped with Mornius to the rubble below the rocky ledge, and then sank down, leaning to rest his back against the crumbling layers of stone. Ren Nietzsche, clad in his new black armor, marking him as a guard, strode toward him. A thin scar running from his temple to his chin twisted his lip forever into a fierce expression. Not once had Galen seen the tawny-skinned young man smile, yet his manner was welcoming as he knelt, unstopping his little flask and handing it over. Galen took his time sipping the hillfolk mead as he savored Ren's company, a man that he could sense was very close to his same age. He recognized the taste of the beverage in his mouth, a fermented honey known as Roy that had been popular in Kitterin. He swallowed and then sighed, enjoying the bite of the alcohol warming his throat. From out of the corner of his vision he watched as the new guard shrugged off his pack, the scar along his cheek stretching the left corner of his mouth downward. As he studied him, Galen recalled what Tarek had said about Kavin Roth, how the commander had implied that other people in the company had suffered too. Staring at Ren, Galen frowned. "I'm sorry," he said abruptly. Ren glanced at him and shrugged. "You're not the only one who's having trouble," said the guard. "Tarek's wise to grant us this rest, even if it does slow us down." "No." Galen gestured to the young man's disfigurement. "I'm sorry about what happened to your face. If we'd known each other sooner, my staff could have healed that." As Ren's fingers explored his scar, water gurgled behind their backs, trickling blood red down the shale from the glacier above them. Galen watched the guard's somber brown eyes blink at the brightness of the snow and then lift to meet his gaze. With a shudder, Galen turned away. Behind his back, he raised his arm to return the flask to its owner. The guard stayed his hand. "You keep it," Ren said. "You'll need it again if we keep to this pace." Frowning, Galen hooked the metal flask to his belt. He's probably right, Galen thought, and then he winced at the throbbing pain behind his temples. He slapped the snow from his thighs and staggered to his feet. Leaning on his staff, he scanned the faces around him. While a few of the warriors sprawled flat on their backs in the drifts beyond the ledge, most were huddling together for warmth beneath the stony shelf. Tarek waited out in the open, standing apart from his men, his back bent as he tended to his horse. Approaching him, Galen noticed Darkfire's drooping head and the stallion's heaving ribs as he pawed the icy rocks where the horses stood. "He looks tired," said Galen when Tarek glanced over. The commander nodded, his attention lowered to the horse's right front foot that he held lifted and propped against his knee. "He's hungry," said Tarek, rubbing a salve deep into the crack Galen saw low on the animal's hoof. "And cold. I need to get him where I can dry him off and throw on his blanket. We'll make for those trees and then stop for the night." He pointed, and Galen looked down beneath the glacier's icy spine to glimpse the outline of treetops through the misty shroud below. "See the fog?" Tarek asked. "I'm betting there's no wind." "How long do you think until we get there?" Galen asked. "How many—" He broke off when Darkfire lipped at his friend's icy hair. Chuckling, Tarek caressed the big horse behind his ears, but then sobered as he noticed the far-off clouds. "A few hours if the weather holds," Tarek said. "Threats like that?" He jerked his chin at the sunless horizon. "Could mean our deaths, and teardawns." Following the commander's stare, Galen lurched forward a few paces with his staff and then stopped, mesmerized by the slow rolling tumble of the advancing clouds. What you said about... He paused. About what? Asked Tarek behind him. Galen, watching the distant mountains darken one by one, tilted his head to speak over his shoulder. Something you told me earlier, he said, about your father. You said that he was hard to bear when you're hurting, and that's why you're here. Averting his face for the sake of politeness, Galen asked, Why were you hurting, Tarek? Shifting slightly, he risked a glance at the older man hunched beside his horse. Tarek ducked his chin, his expression thoughtful as he ran his gloved hands down the animal's front legs. I lost a good friend, Tarek said. He patted the horse's shoulder and then straightened. She was a neighbor of ours. My brother Cameron adored her. He thought of her as his big sister, but to me, Tarek grimaced, she was more. Florina Vlyn, he continued. She was the brave one who always had to go first ahead of us boys. Glancing at his horse, Tarek smiled. Things change, I guess. A priest from Erebos' cult came to Kitterin seeking converts. He paused. It was at a time when she was bored with her life, and so she was taken in, Tarek said. I tried, but I could not dissuade her. I think she expected us to follow her again, but we didn't. Galen turned, watching Tarek work his way behind Darkfire's rump to the animal's left side. He cocked his head, seeing the light slowly darken in his friend's eyes as Tarek remembered. The priests work to convince people the Erebos will free them from the elves' control, the commander went on, and that their god is going to make them a new earth. Tarek rolled his eyes. Farina's a bright woman, but Erebos got into her head, so she left with them, bragging to us about how she was going to save humanity, and she took her mouse of a father Nithra with her. So she's your enemy now, said Galen. Tarek nodded. Yes, so she is. He mused aloud. I have to believe that one day she'll be forced to see the truth, and when that happens, his jaw hardened. I fear for her. Hoping to change the subject, Galen motioned to Tarek's horse. My legs can't handle his back anymore, he said. I need to walk. Tarek flicked him a scowl and then shifted sideways to tighten the stallion's saddle. Pushing at the pommel with his left hand, he tugged at the girth with his right. You're still not well, he observed. You've been frail since Heartwood. What about the sleds? Galen asked, pointing. You let me ride in one before. It was after the battle, remember? That was a wagon, Tarek said. Those sleds, he glanced to where the ponies stood waiting in their traces, aren't meant to carry people. Sitting there alone, you'd freeze to death. Galen jumped sideways when Tarek mounted, avoiding Darkfire's heavy hooves. Behind him, he heard the grunts of the warriors climbing to their feet, the hurried crunching of snow as the men struggled to reform their line. What I need right now is for you to recover, Tarek said. He reined the horse in close and leaned over, thrusting out his hand. Now climb up, it's time to go. He caught Galen's upper arm and then stared into his eyes, lowering his voice. You'll do as I say now, he said, or do you want to stay sick? His grip tightened all at once, and Galen yelped as he was dragged off his feet, to dangle in the commander's strong grasp as though he were an obstinate child. Galen felt his face go hot as he heard laughter from Tarek's men. Angrily, he reached with his leg and pulled himself onto the horse, straddling the green-gold pad that extended behind Tarek's saddle. For a moment, he sat still, breathing hard and clenching his staff, feeling the horse's wide haunches tilt beneath him. Then something snapped within his head. Desperately, he pulled against Tarek's fingers grasping his arm, struggling in vain to lift Mornius enough to dismount. Without a word, Tarek backed his horse under the lone bluebark tree jutting from the shoulders of the cliff. Galen shivered as icy fragments skittered down his neck from the frozen branches above. Then, with a heavy thump, the boughs gave way, dropping their snowy burden upon his head. He yelled and then sputtered, the coldness clinging to his face and neck as he felt Tarek's grip leave his arm, and the horse beneath him jump forward. That's the same thing I did to Tarek, said a gravelly voice behind his back, when he was still a boy. Galen, recognizing the speaker as Captain Viergen, cleared the snow from his eyes with a swipe of his left arm. Then, blinking hard, he saw the older man draw beside him on his dappled gray horse. I did detect a slight limp, Commander, the captain said. It's the right foreleg. While Galen sagged in defeat, Tarek nodded to his second-in-command. Fires cracked his hoof, Tarek said. I don't think it's that bad, but I see it, Viergen said. You used my salve, he went on. Good man. Once it dries, it will form a nice patch. Just keep him off the ice. Wheeling his tall gelding, Viergen faced the men standing ready behind them and then paused. glancing over to meet Galen's stare. "You don't get to be a savage anymore, my lad," the captain chided. "If you want to remain here among us, you must show some respect." Galen lowered his head, listening as Virgin urged his horse into motion with 2 sharp clicks of his tongue. "Let's hope he makes it to Teardon," Virgin called back. Galen shot a glance over his shoulder at the captain, watching as the older man reclaimed his position behind the men. Then, frowning, Galen looked forward and bit his lip. "Let's hope who makes it to Teardon," he wondered in silence. Was he talking about me or Tarek's horse? Again he gripped the cantle with his knees and thighs. The muddle of his thoughts interrupted as Darkfire lumbered forward. He heard the uneven crunching of hooves and feet breaking through the snow as the warriors followed their commander, the hissing runners of the sleds when, with protesting squeals, the little ponies drew in front of the company to again pack the trail. Galen let his mind wander. He watched as gradually the sun bed itself down behind the jagged ridge to the east, lighting fire to the darkening clouds. After what seemed like hours, he felt the jerk of Tarek's arms, and then the horse beneath his aching thighs stumbled to a halt. Again the commander twisted in his saddle, the motion rousing Galen fully. Lifting his face from Tarek's shoulder, he saw his friend staring past him, and Tarek's hazel eyes taking in the tired faces of his men. "No fires tonight," Tarek announced, his words drawing a groan from several raw throats, or too exposed. "Find the blankets." Turning, Tarek scowled at his captain. "Virgin, pitch half the tents, less if possible, and pack the men in. Not all of us will get to sleep, but at least we'll stay warm." Felrina, standing on the lowest step in the watery chamber, turned from the pool's midnight calm. "Teardon?" she asked, her voice echoing faintly down the adjoining tunnels. Facing her leader, she lifted her staff and tilted its blazing stone toward him. "You haven't the balls for it, mens. Besides, the Master Swords would stop you," she said. "They have friends, you know, powerful friends, the creator of Teardon himself." She paused, watching Mens pick at a sore on his jaw. He snorted. "You mean the Eris elves?" he asked with a sneer. "They focus on one thing now, or didn't you know? They care for the trees." "That's right," he added, seeing her stare. "Word has it that they don't teach the Talador anymore. They've given that task to their humans in the city." "No." Felrina shook her head. "The history preserved at Teardon is precious to them." She closed her eyes, attuning her ears to the lapping sound of the water as she shifted back to face it. She could sense Veeler's spirit within the subterranean tarn, under its surface but near to where she stood. The former giant slaver was listening, she realized, weighing in silence their every word. She scowled at the swirls of oil she glimpsed on the water, the residue of fat from the many humans she had formed into Dax. Men's body was changing too, she observed. The old magic he wielded feasted on his flesh like a coiled and hungry worm. His many attempts to master that power were slowly taking his life. "Well, I remain as I am," she thought, peering down at her chest and arms. "After he dies." She risked a glance at the senior blackrobe standing uncomfortably close beside her. "I will be left to rule." "If I did conquer Teardon," Mens went on, "if I had my winged army dive at its heart, think of the message that would send to the world." Felrina nodded. His voice sounded wet to her ears, his ragged inhalations hitching in his bony chest. "The elves would fear me," he said, "and your precious Tarek would cower at my feet. I'd make him grovel to you, Felrina, and beg you for his life." She lowered her head, her cheeks flaming hot as she turned again toward the man who was her superior. His wide black eyes caught the light from across the room, the smoking torch held high by her faithful apprentice. Something about Men's expression tugged at her then, conjuring thoughts of the future Erebos planned. If you succeeded. She broke off as the blackrobe's eyes seemed to bulge, his lips peeling back from his stained teeth. "Yes," Men's whispered. "Out with the old and in with the new, and created by Erebos for humans alone. Imagine a world with no elves to answer to." Felrina studied him. She doubted very much that he would survive to see that day. Even now he was nothing but bones, his skin stretched taut over his skull. Yet she perceived how much he was animated by the thought of more killing, driven by the fire devouring his soul. "All you think about is war," said Felrina. She glanced at the lanky figure beside the torch. Respectful as always, her apprentice Gulgren stared back, his young eyes glistening as he tracked her every move. "We can't do anything without foods, mens," she continued, "and our suppliers have refused us. Without their tithe, how will we survive the winter?" Men snorted. "That's your problem. If the croppers aren't so willing, confiscate their animals and crops. Seize them, too, while you're at it. You can make them into warriors for me." She glared into space, tasting his words. "If only I could," she thought. "I hate begging and they know it, but if I lose them to men's, we have no farms." Florina shook her head. "What about later when the farms are all gone and we have no one to provide us food? How will you fight then when your warriors are starving?" As Mens bit his lip, Florina frowned. The gesture reminded her of the deep-thinking young man who had introduced her to the peace of Erebos' darkness, and to the paradox that, in the end, death would spell resurrection for humans, a new beginning on a world all their own. For a moment she ached for him, for the sane human being who had once persuaded her to leave Kitterin. She watched him glance toward her pool. "They won't starve," Mens said. "Not if you give me what I need. I'll feed them the croppers if I have to." "Feed them the—" Florina caught her breath. Mens spun around and glared. "Why does that shock you?" he asked. "What do you suppose happens to the captives that I consider unfit for the altar? Do you think I just send them on their way? We can't keep prisoners if we're short on provisions ourselves, and my army must be fed. If the croppers won't cooperate, hand them over to me, Florina, and I'll put them to use." "I just assumed that you—" she said, and then swallowed thickly. "Found some clever way to dispose of them." "Indeed I have," said Mens. "I ram hooks through here." He jabbed his thumb into the skin beneath his chin. "And out of the mouth," he continued. "Then I dangle them 2 or 3 at a time above my fighters. They drop and are consumed once their jawbones are pulled from their skulls." "No!" Florina covered her mouth with her hand, but the word, a traitorous cry of protest, had already broken from her lips. As her staff flared in response beside her, its crimson fire licked at her slender wrist. She paused, staring at its power and shivering. Then, as subtly as she could within her robe's heavy folds, she clutched at her stomach. He nodded at her reaction. "It's a terrible waste, I agree," he said, frowning. "But most are still alive when my warriors start in, so Erebos is strengthened by these deaths. He is always there for the feedings. If you want the truth, I think he does something to the body so they don't bleed out." "So it does take some time," Florina said. Again she swallowed, wincing at the dryness in her throat and the accusing look on her leader's face. "That's good." She kept her tone carefully neutral, feigning a calm that she did not feel. "But then aren't we left with fewer prisoners for our communions?" she asked. "We have less for your whatever it is that you do, and for the poisonings in our dungeons too. These are the deaths that benefit Erebos, the ones that we can prolong." She stopped, cringing as a shadow fell over them both. Glancing upward, Florina stared at the darkness taking on shape above her head, a dragon unfurling its massive wings. "Erebos is here," she whispered. "He senses your distress, my dear," said Mens, "as do I. You know, Florina, sometimes I think your heart's not in it. Every day we achieve so much here. Where is your enthusiasm for your work?" "I have it," she said, tipping back her chin. She spread her arms, ignoring Mens as she searched the granite ceiling for the face of her god. "Great Lord, believe in me," she called, "for I believe in you. I just feel that we ought to rethink." "Then be creative," Mens interjected. The black robe gestured to the pool's flat surface. "You have a warder's power at your command and Veeler skill, so make better dacks. Design them so that they don't need food. Then we wouldn't have to worry about this, would we?" Florina glared at him. "Don't be absurd," she said. "I can reshape the bones and skin into wings, but I cannot change what the internal organs do. Even Veeler has limits." Mens averted his gaze from her staff's bright flames, the conduit to Erebos' power that he so openly craved. Again she glanced up, watching as the dragon's oppressive shadow faded into the rocks. "The point is I need better warriors." Mens thumped the granite floor beside her with his bloodstone staff. "If you don't produce them soon, Florina, I will indeed feed the croppers to my dacks. Then once I'm finished with that, I'll see how long you can hang by your jaw. Do you hear?" As the fire faded from her staff, Verena quietly gulped and nodded.